Hello and welcome back. Today's demonstration is quite seasonal and it's one I've wanted to do for quite a while now. The techniques I'm going to use are very simple, but it'd be quite useful before starting this exercise if you had a quick look at the leaf demonstration I did back in autumn 2020. Within the painting we're going to create a mixture of positive and negative shapes, lots of warm colours and lots of lost and found edges. My 6-colour palette is extremely warm and contains Ultramarine, Raw Sienna, Burnt Sienna, Gamboge Hue, Alizarin Crimson and Light Red. My paper today is Fabriano Artistico Extra White 140 soft grain. This is very similar to a knot surface paper which would work just as well. And the size of my paper today is slightly larger than usual. It's 28 by 38 centimetres. And I'm going to apply the paint today with a small Hake, a variety of goat herd calligraphy brushes, a rigger, and I'm also going to use a stick as well. To trace the leaves I'm also going to need a soft pencil, a 2 or a 3B would be perfect, and a soft eraser will also be useful just to remove any excess pencil marks once you've completed the painting. And finally you're going to need a few autumn leaves to trace around for your design. I've started by laying half a dozen leaves down on my paper. These are all from the same tree, so there's quite a unity to them. Some are facing upwards, some are facing downwards, just giving the composition a little bit of variety. And I've laid them out in a fashion that looks roughly if they're sort of spreading off the same branch. And I'm going to start by tracing around these leaves with a soft pencil. I think I'm using a 2 or a 3B here. Following the contours of the design, making quite a firm mark with my pencil as well. It really helps if you flatten your leaves before you start this process. What I tend to do is place them between a couple of sheets of newspaper and put a board on top and a few heavy books on top of that. Leave them overnight and they should dry nice and flat. Once you've completed tracing a leaf, repeat the process for the remaining leaves in the design. I'm going to put the leaves that I've used carefully to one side because I'm going to need these later when I get to the painting part of the process. As you can see, I've made quite a firm mark with my pencil, creating quite a strong outline, and this will help me to sort of follow the design of the leaves later when I get lots of washes on the surface of the paper. All the pencil marks can be erased once the painting's been finished, so don't worry about making quite a firm mark with your pencil strokes. I'm going to start the painting process with a very light loose wash to begin with, and I'm using a Hake to do this, and I'm going to use a mixture of some very pale colours, a little bit of raw sienna, a touch of gamboge as well, very lightly applied, lots of water, and adding a touch of light red into that as well, letting that dribble down the page. I've got my board tilted slightly more steeply than I normally do, a couple of sketchbooks behind it. I don't want to get too dark with this initial wash. I'm going to apply lots of deeper tones later, so I don't want to lose the contrast in the design. I'm going to apply lots of areas of shadow as well further down the page behind some of the leaves, so this initial wash just is a way of tinting the paper a little bit, getting a little bit of warmth and removing the starkness of the white of the paper. I was always leaving some white areas, slowly adding more pigment in here and there, aware that this is going to dry back a little bit paler than it appears at the moment, and using gravity to soften the wash and blend the colours. Touch more light red towards the bottom. And using a sponge to remove a little bit of pigment from the leaf in the bottom left hand corner. This leaf is going to be extremely pale with a dark shadow behind it, so I don't want to get too much pigment onto this particular area of the paper. Touch more colour onto the right hand side, again light red with a touch of burnt sienna, and a touch more raw sienna going in as well, just to warm things up. Mopping it with a sponge. All the water I've used has created a few peaks and valleys in the paper, so I'm just going to tilt the paper a little bit to prevent the pigment from gathering too much in the valleys. Spreading it around the paper, creating a much smoother, more gradual wash. I'm going to go away now and have a cup of coffee and leave the initial wash to dry completely. Now that's completely dry, I can begin to create the leaves in the painting. Starting with quite a large calligraphy brush, using the pigment that's still left on my palette from that initial wash. And I'm going to paint a few soft tones in the background, wetting the paper in places. I want the whole painting to be very soft edge, so I'm using these initial strokes of paint just to soften some of the edges of some of the leaves. Again, very wet with these strokes of paint, lots of water added. And again, lots of warm colour, lots of pale colour as well. I don't want to get too dark at this stage. Starting the leaves with a little bit of negative painting. I'm just going to paint around the leaf in the top left hand corner there. This leaf is going to be light against dark, almost like a little ghost at the top of the painting. Adding a little bit of pigment into the leaf itself, just to wet the paper a little bit. Don't want to get that too dark. And adding further pigment onto the paper, just softening some of the edges of the leaves further down the paper. Creating a colour grey now. This is light red mixed with ultramarine, which creates a beautiful purple colour which should complement the yellows and oranges in the design beautifully. Using this colour to paint around the leaf at the top of the paper, creating a nice negative shape. Doing this all very quickly, trying not to get too exact with the marks that I make. Trying to keep it loose. Using a slightly more pointed brush just to add one or two details, one or two slightly sharper marks. And continuing with the negative painting, slightly softer colour on the right hand side of the leaf. Touch of pigment into the leaf itself, just to wet the paper again. And picking up the leaf I've used for this particular tracing, I'm going to paint on the back some neat paint, a little bit of burnt sienna, going over the vein side of the leaf, picking up some of the textures, adding in a touch of ultramarine as well. I'm just going to print that onto the slightly damp paper, creating a few textures, a few marks, a little bit of a skeletal form. And a few touches with my calligraphy brush just to refine that design slightly. I'm not going to fiddle with it too much. I want to keep the design nice and fresh and simple. Picking up a pointed calligraphy brush now and mixing together some ultramarine with some burnt sienna, creating a very dark colour. This is almost neat paint, hardly any water in it at all. Touch of alizarin going in there as well. and creating a little bit of a branch at the very top of the painting. Some of this is going onto dry paper, some of it into wet, so it's going to bleed slightly. And creating a stalk for the leaf as well. Switching brushes all the time. I'm going to start creating some of the leaves in the centre now. Very wet mix. This is Gamboge mixed with a touch of raw sienna. Little bits of light red as well in there. Very loosely applied. Going over the edge of the leaf as well, so I'm creating some soft edges in places. The top of the leaf is quite dry, so I'm going to get some sharper marks here. And I'm using a slightly warmer colour here as well, lots more light red in this. Again, painting quite quickly, not being too worried about following the exact tracing of the leaf. I'd rather keep the design very fresh and very spontaneous rather than try to follow every single nook and cranny of the tracing. Lots of warm colours going in here, using that same mix of Gamboge, raw sienna and little bits of light red. Some soft edges, some sharp edges. And what I'm hoping to do is create a painting that's got quite an ethereal feel with soft edges bleeding into the leaves and a glow of colour in the background. Slightly sharper mark again, going onto dry paper. The pigment is gathering again in these little valleys that have formed on the surface of the paper, so again I'll use some tilting techniques to spread that around a little bit later. Picking up my sponge, just going to remove a touch of pigment from the bottom of the leaf there. And tilting my board and allowing the pigment to spread and blend a little bit. While the leaf is still wet, I can continue to drop in further pigment and allow that to bleed and blend on the surface of the paper. Picking up a rigger now, putting in a stalk for that leaf. And finding a stick to scratch in the veins. Pigment should gather in these scratch marks and create a very subtle feeling of lines on the surface of the leaf. Again, tilting my board to prevent the pigment from gathering too much in the valleys on the paper. A little bit of splatter, light red mixed with a little bit of burnt sienna, and a little bit of darker splatter, adding a touch of ultramarine to the brush as well. Creating another leaf using the same technique. Lots of light colours to begin with, pale washes of raw sienna, gamboge, touches of light red. Roughly following the design that I traced before, but working quite quickly. I want to keep the paint moving, keep everything fresh. Adding a touch of alizarin into that mix as well, and little bits of burnt sienna, very warm colours. And adding a little bit of ultramarine in there as well, creating some darker tones. And again, using gravity to move the paint around, blend the pigment on the paper, slowly moving that bead of paint towards the edges of the tracing. Again, that pigment is gathering in those valleys, so I'm continuing to use gravity to move it down, and putting another sketchbook behind my board to help with the blending process. Going to add some darker colours into this leaf now. Ultramarine mixed with light red. Touches of burnt sienna in there as well, and little bits of alizarin. Very dark, warm tones. As with the leaf to the left, I'm dropping in this dark pigment into the leaf while it's still extremely wet, so it's going to blend and spread beautifully and create some lovely translucent colours. Trying to let gravity and the flow of the watercolour do a lot of the work for me. Picking up my stick again and scratching in some veins. Just a few lines scratched into the surface. Some of these will drag bits of pigment, and in others I'm just going to create little divots in the paper where pigment will gather, creating some lovely subtle lines. Using my rigger again and some of that dark pigment on my palette just to put in the stem for the leaf. Further dark pigment dropping into that leaf on the right hand side just to darken it in places, and a few little spots as well. A few tiny spots added with the rigger. Trying not to fiddle, want to keep it fresh. Removing a little bit of pigment with my brush, and again using gravity to blend the paint and prevent it from gathering too much in the valleys of the paper. Creating a further leaf on the right, again same idea, very warm light colours. mixtures of the Gamboge, raw sienna, light red, things that are on my palette at the moment. Loosely following the tracing that I've created. And I'm going to create this leaf with a pale side on the left and a darker side on the right. So some very soft ghostly colours on the left hand side, and I'm going to create some slightly darker tones on the right. Same technique, lots of water, slowly dropping in darker passages of pigment and allowing those to blend on the paper. The paper here is quite dry, so I'm going to get some nice crisp edges on the right hand side of this leaf. Slowly adding darker passages of pigment, little bits of ultramarine mixed with the light red and the burnt sienna as well. Trying to keep it very loose and very fresh. Bit of splatter. And a bit of splatter further down as well. Little bits of texture. Insects and spots on the leaf. And scratching in some veins into that leaf on the right as well. Same idea as before. Just a few lines. Don't overdo this. Just to give an impression. And using my rigger and some of the dark pigment on my palette to paint in the stem. While I've got the rigger in my hand, I'm going to paint in a few further twigs on the branch. And a further stroke of paint for the branch itself. A couple of very fine lines with my rigger on the left hand side, further little bits of twig. And using a sponge to clean up a little dribble there. The leaf on the left hand side has bled just a little bit too much, so I'm just going to soften that a little bit with my sponge. I'm going to create a second negative shape in the bottom left hand corner. I'm going to start this process by just using a little bit of that pale pigment on my palette to paint around the leaf in the bottom left. touch more pigment into the leaf above it as well. Lots of pale pigment here, lots of water as well. Painting around the tracing. Paper's completely dry here, so I'm going to get quite a sharp mark. Again, doing this very loosely, not following every single little bit of the design. Varying the intensity of the colour slightly from area to area. And I'm creating a darker colour now. This is the light red mixed with the ultramarine. Dark shadow behind the leaf, which should create quite a nice feeling of space in the painting. All these marks going wet into wet, so they're going to blend and soften. And a bit more splatter. This is light red splattering over that leaf on the left hand side, and a little bit of texture below as well. A few more spots on the leaf. And finding the leaf that I use for that leaf in the bottom left, and I'm going to add a little bit of printed texture to this leaf as well. Again with some dark colours, painted onto the veiny side of the leaf. Neat paint, more or less. Bits of burnt sienna and little bits of light red as well, along with other dark colours that are on the palette, little bits of ultramarine. Painted loosely over the leaf, quite thick paint, and placing that carefully over the design and printing a little bit of texture. This is printing onto dry paper, so I'm getting some slightly crisper marks than I did for the first print that I created. And a few marks into that leaf as well, using my calligraphy brush and a little bit of watered down pigment. Again, I don't want to fiddle too much with that, I want to keep it very simple and fresh. Bit more ultramarine onto my palette, making a nice dark mix with my rigger. And adding the bottom of the branch. Slight variation of that mix, adding a touch of Alizarin Crimson into it. Further little twigs coming off the branch. Very loosely painted using the spring of the rigger. Picking up a calligraphy brush again, one leaf to paint. Using the same technique as before, starting with lots of pale warm colours, following the tracing of the drawing very quickly, wetting the paper, keeping this initial wash very wet. And while that leaf is still very wet, I can drop in some darker pigment, bits of light red mixed with a little bit of alizarin, dropped into the wet paint, and using gravity to allow that to blend and spread on the paper. Tilting my board to guide it a little bit. A few darker passages using Ultramarine mixed with light red and burnt sienna. And again blending that by tilting my board. Picking up a stick, scratching in the veins again. It's best to scratch in these lines while the paint is still very wet. This will allow the pigment to gather in the grooves that you've scratched into the paper. Getting a little bit of darker pigment onto my rigger brush again, creating the stem. And getting a bit of dark pigment onto a calligraphy brush, applying a further little bit of splatter, further bits of texture. A few spots with my rigger, little dots on the leaf, little imperfections. Further blending by tilting the board, helping to maintain the very subtle blends of colour and keep things very fresh. Softening an edge there with a little bit of fresh water. And removing some dribbles of paint from the board. Removing a touch of pigment from the very bottom corner, where it's just bled a little bit too much. Drying that with a bit of kitchen paper as well. Having a look, is there anything else to do? Tidying up the point of that leaf with a rigger brush. Creating a dark mix again. And a few further spots. And before I start to fiddle, I think I'm going to stop. As this demonstration is a little bit longer than many of the exercises that I post, I'll try to put together a brief step-by-step guide so that you can follow the basic process for creating this. When you have a go at painting this, try to include lots of soft edges to some of your leaves. It just creates a little bit of mystery and atmosphere to the painting and prevents it from becoming a series of solid shapes. The soft edges also create a nice contrast with the sharper textured marks in the painting. I really like using positive and negative shapes for this exercise. It gives a ghostly Halloween feel to some of the leaves and gives you the opportunity to create some shadows in the painting, which gives the painting a little bit more depth and variety. As always, you don't have to stick to the palette that I've used here. The technique would work just as well with greens or reds or any colour that you like. Whatever colours you decide to use, make sure you use lots of water to keep the pigment moving and flowing freely. I hope you enjoy having a go at this. It was certainly fun to paint, and please keep posting your paintings to Facebook. They're always great to see. Until next time, take care and happy painting.